Hey friends, welcome back to another video here with a really special guest. I've been waiting a long time to have her on this show. Her name is Tracy Primeau. She is former shift manager at Bruce Power, as well as involved with Women in Nuclear. Tracy, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to introduce myself in initial name of one. Tracy Indijika, Nipissing Indijapa, Magizi Dodem. My name's Tracy Primeau. I'm from Nipissing First Nation, and I belong to the Eagle Clan. In the Indigenous world, we always start with saying who we belong to. That's how we introduce ourselves. So I thought I would do that today. You probably haven't had too many people do that on your podcast yet. And then I'm happy to tell my story. Where would you like me to start?
Let's start from the beginning. Tell us about how you got into the industry and your experiences working from the shop floor all the way to becoming shift manager, which is a very prestigious position at a nuclear site.
So I started at the Pickering Generating Station in 1990. I was 22. I had just finished at University of Waterloo, where I have an arts degree. And I'm probably one of the only shift managers who can say that. Really thought I wanted to be a teacher, but I got to spend some time doing that as part of the co-op program and quickly realized I did not want to spend the rest of my life with high school students. So I became an operator in training at the Pickering A station. I was there for 5 years, and then I transferred to the Bruce. At the time, we were at the same company, and you could just trade with someone else. So someone wanted to move to the city, and I wanted to move home. I'm from Kincardine, and then Bruce A. I worked at Bruce A. Went through a shutdown, and I kind of thought perhaps I was going to have to leave ops and do something else in the nuclear industry until British Energy came along and decided to restart units 3 and 4. So I applied to become an authorized nuclear operator. That's the person who runs the reactor. And I was the first woman to achieve that role at the Bruce A site. So being an authorized nuclear operator is a great job. You are, however, stuck in front of the reactor. You don't really get to, influence higher leadership. Your work shift, which I did for most of my career. And so I applied to move into the control room shift supervisor role and then the shift manager role. The shift manager is responsible for the safety of the public, the plant, and the people, and they hold the license for the station whenever they're on duty. So basically, they are the in charge of the plant whenever they're working shift. And after 4 o'clock, they are the top the CEO basically of the station. It's a great job, the best job I had, and I did a lot of other jobs in operations, working with maintenance and different areas. But being a shift manager was by far the best job I ever had. And I was the first female shift manager who came from the shop floor, so came from the trades side of things, and worked my way up. And I think the only Indigenous one.
Yeah, those are incredible accomplishments. I almost transport myself back in time to an industry that looked very different.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Women in Nuclear, which I do sit on the board of, as Osama has mentioned. We still sit at 23% of the workforce. However, what I will say, and I've really seen this change, is there's a lot more women at the top. We're not on par with, say, retail or finance yet, but when you look at the Ontario Power Generation Board, for example, which I'm a member of, we are more than 50% female, and the executive leadership team at OPG is the same. As young people, as young women and young men come into the industry and they look up, they are seeing women there now. The president and CEO and CNO of NB Power is a woman. We have the president of NWMO as a woman. So more and more, if you look around the industry, you see female leaders leading these organizations. That's a big change from when I joined Ontario Hydro in 1990. Certainly, as a young Indigenous woman, I never saw myself being on the board of Ontario Power Generation. There was nobody there who looked like me, and there was nobody. There was no women at all, and I also didn't see those women in the control room or in senior leadership roles. So that's a big change, and it's a really important change. Another thing I would say is that we really need to, right now, the way the industry is going, we really need to make sure we get all of those people at the table, all of the diverse people, women, people of color, Indigenous people, because there's so much growth happening right now in our industry. We need all the talent we can get. And it's a great opportunity for people who are, looking to join an industry that is just growing like so fast, fastest, I've been around for 33 years and in this industry. I've never seen it. I've never seen this much growth. And I've been through a couple renaissances. And so it's really, really exciting time. I will talk a little bit about the Indigenous piece. So I often say when I'm asked to speak to different groups about nuclear and or Indigenous relationships, there's no path to net zero without nuclear. And that path goes through a traditional territory. So no matter where you're building, whether you're a supply chain or utility or research, you are in a traditional territory of a First Nation, and that territory could be covered by treaties, and in which case there is clear who you need to talk to, and the government will tell you who you need to consult with, or it may not be. It may be unceded territory, a territory that was never covered by a treaty, but still the traditional territory of some First Nation. In Ontario, most area do have a treaty around them. I myself am from the Robinson Huron Treaty area, but in other parts of Canada, New Brunswick has a totally different treaty. So it really depends on where you are. My advice is always to just build relationships before you need anything. So, go to the door, like introduce yourself, start building that relationship before you're actually doing any work or need a partnership or whatever the case may be with those First Nations or Indigenous organizations, whatever the case may be. I think that's really the biggest takeaway I always say to people, that you have to build that relationship if you want to be successful. And something else that I think a lot of people don't realize is that the duty to consult and the free, prior, informed consent, all the sort of government buzzwords um, are required to do. But the reality is, if you engage early, you are going to have a more successful project. And if you have that, equity partnership, employee opportunities, whatever the case may be, the whole project is going to be more successful. So it's not just about you have to do it; it's actually going to increase your bottom line. And I think some people sometimes forget that. And I mean, Canada's unique in this way. Sometimes I have to spend a little bit more time explaining it to people who didn't grow up here.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job explaining how it's important to develop that trust and those relationships ahead of time,
Yes.
right? Because we got small modular reactors, we got even non-nuclear side, right? We have hydro dams being built, and it's important to educate and build those relationships ahead of time instead of coming in from a greedy perspective or selfish perspective and saying that, hey, listen, like, let's do this, right?
Even a patriarchal uh, colonizing perspective where it's like the savior. We're here to help you, but rather than we're here to work with you in a partnership. But before we even do that, let's just get to know each other. My sister is the president of the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Businesses, and she uses this phrase all the time that, relationships are built with Indigenous communities at the speed of trust. It may take a while for you to get to that level of trust where you can actually start to talk about working alongside on a project or a build or whatever the case may be. And you have to put the time in. We make decisions in the Indigenous community 7 generations ahead. Like we're thinking when someone comes to us and says we want to build an SMR, let's say, Osama. We're thinking, okay, what does that mean for 7 generations? My grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren. That's how we're making decisions. So it's going to take us longer to make those decisions, and it's going to take patience all around the table, to get to that point where we're having that conversation. I really think that I really truly believe that people are genuinely interested in doing this properly. And I work with a couple of different companies in the uranium mining area, and they have they've asked for my advice because they really want to do it right. And I think generally speaking, corporations do. They just struggle with where to start. And especially your generation, I find the younger generation is very interested in learning more about this, very committed to reconciliation, and I get a lot of like questions from people your age.
My question to you is, if you were to write a master course on Indigenous engagement, what would be the pillars of this core, whether it be utilities, vendors, or other organizations? How do we interface with a group keeping their cultural traditions and their values in mind?
Well, I would start with there's more than 630 First Nations in Canada. So, and we're not all the same. I'm not counting, I'm not talking about Métis and Inuit. That's just First Nations. So it's like a UN, right? You can't. The same thing's not going to work with everybody. So, I mean, that's the first thing I always say is like figure out who you're talking to, because every different area, it's going to be somebody different. There's going to be a different history. There's going to be different traditions, different cultures, and so that's something I always tell people to keep in mind, that we can't be painted with the same brush. Obviously, as I mentioned, trust is huge. Patience is huge. You have to also, I think, quite often rectify the sins of the past before you can have the conversation about the future. So if you are a hydroelectric company that dammed a river and flooded a hunting area, you need to acknowledge that and um, you know rectify that damage with say the Indigenous community before you can even talk about what you're going to do in the future. So it's not you, for example, let's say you were doing that, Osama. It's not you who made that decision, but your company did, or the previous company did, or the previous owner, whatever the case may be. You need to get that. You need to apologize. You need to rectify that financially, or however it is, and then you can have that conversation. A lot of people just they go in with like I want to do great things, and they do, but they have to take into account that past. The Indian Act, was written to make sure Indigenous people didn't succeed. Like if you you couldn't if you became a lawyer, you had to give up your status. I would not have status if in 40 years ago, because I have a university degree and I married a white man. So, so there's all these things that the Indian Act wrote to sort of, keep Indigenous people less successful. And you have to acknowledge those things in the past before you can talk about the future. I think sometimes people, they don't know how to do that. And so they kind of try to skip over it. You know what I mean? You know how it is. Having a difficult conversation is a difficult thing, right? Yeah. And I guess that would be another thing I would add is that don't be afraid to have a difficult conversation. Like we're missing out on opportunities to build relationships and learn from each other if we shy away from those difficult conversations. It's a real loss to that future relationship if you're worried about offending. People, I find this very, it's not just Indigenous, people are so worried about saying something offensive, or not getting something right. Even with land acknowledgements, people are worried about mispronouncing Haudenosaunee or whatever the case may be. My point is just do it. Just start it, have it, because otherwise you won't start the relationship. And it can be hard. I understand that. But if you come with genuine feeling and care, that people see that and they respond to it.
Coming to the table with sincerity.
That's my leadership. That's my leadership takeaway always is because I worked in such a technical world, but I led people. I would always say, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. Then you can start to show your knowledge once they really believe you care. I think that's so key to being a good leader and as I said, building these relationships.
You hit on some really important points, right? And sometimes these points seem pretty obvious, but they're ignored, right? Yeah. Especially in the engagement process. Yeah. So tell me about with this new unprecedented growth in the nuclear industry. There has been a focus on Indigenous engagement. At the CNA conference where we're at right now, yes, there were some incredible seminars being held, and so the energy here is great. Like at the CNA, and I think a lot of folks, a lot of leaders are coming here to learn and to grow and really bring back these lessons learned to their own organizations. What have you seen so far at the CNA in terms of in terms of this topic?
Well, I'm a big fan of the Indigenous Ambassador Program, which was started a couple years ago at the CNA with the help of Chief Emily Weetung, and it matches up an expert in the nuclear industry with a member of chief or council. So they have someone show them around, introduce them to people. Um, you know, these are people who have nothing to do with the industry. And as a Indigenous person in the industry, I get to get involved with that, right? I get to help explain what a shift manager does, or why nuclear power is safe. I always say, it's going to be more believable coming from me than an old white guy. um, if I especially because I find quite often in Ontario, I probably have a cousin somewhere on your First Nation. So I find that I love that. There's been a lot of workshops done at the CNA, sort of outside the main plenary sessions, but also a lot of conversation at the plenary sessions. Lots of Indigenous people on our main stage. The opening ceremony is now usually a celebration of Indigenous dance or a prayer or whatever the case may be, singing. I think that's fantastic, and I really think in this area, particularly, nuclear is leading.
Yeah.
I mean, I see the same thing at the Canadian Nuclear Society. I see the same thing at Women in Nuclear Conference. I don't see it at other conferences I go to this at the same level. There's a real engagement. Just today in our Women in Nuclear meeting, someone asked me a question about Indigenous scholarships, and I said, you know what, we should really ask an elder. And we have an elder that we can go to in Women in Nuclear, and so does the NWMO, and so there's this connection now of of acknowledging, first of all, that nuclear needs to grow alongside Indigenous communities, but also that advice is really needed in decision making. I talked about the 7 generations, but just the whole Indigenous wisdom of the environment, being pulled into the technical, like the scientific, the I'm going to say traditionally scientific, knowledge of the environment is something that's now being really embraced and looked for. NWO does a great job of that. I will say, but they're not the only ones. Like, people are starting to realize that they missed out on a real chunk of knowledge by not tapping those knowledge keepers and trappers and for their knowledge. There's this great story that the CEO of International Indigenous Speakers Bureau, Shannon, told me once about this company in BC that needed to dam up a river, and it was really hard to get to, and everything they tried was failing. And they went to a local trapper and knowledge keeper, and they said, "We're having trouble getting this river like dammed. Like, do you have any ideas?" He goes, "Yeah, give me a couple days." And and so he went away, and he came back, and the river was dammed. And they're like, "How did you do this?" Like, we had all these engineers looking at it, everyone was looking at it, and he's like, "I just caught a couple beavers and threw them in the water, and they built a dam." And you're like, "Oh my gosh, that's so simple." But it's just that, that lived on the land for 10,000 years.
Yeah.
That knowledge has been passed down from generation to generation, right? And let's make sure we're using it when we're making these decisions. Which way the river is going to flow? Where are we going to have impact? When do the fish spawn? When are the bears mating? Like, all of those things is knowledge that's known, and we need to use it.
Traditional sciences.
Exactly. I'm not an expert in any of those things, but I do see how I have seen many instances where it's been used and used well.
Very cool. Yeah, I've heard of some studies and some stories about traditional sciences in Indigenous communities. My time attending conferences and seminars, and like, it's so fascinating. One example that I heard was the traditional value of copper in Indigenous culture, and so copper is seen as something that is used as vessels and uh, to purify. And so, like, when I hear of a lot of Indigenous stories speaking about different materials, and I see how these materials are even used in our industry. It really fascinates me.
Yeah, and there's so much like that, like in Ontario, there's some parks that they burn the grass in a certain time of year in order to sort of like I'm going to say kill the bad and regrow the good. And that has been a practice that has been done for centuries by Indigenous peoples who lived in the Greater Toronto area. That has been kept up, and we're still doing it. You know, and there's lots of conversation about. Of course, there's lots of conversation right now about using this knowledge to fight climate change, which is exactly what we're doing here at the nuclear conference. But all of those prescribed burns or moving things around. I mean, the wildfires are an example out west. In the past, there would be traditional tribes that would burn certain pieces of the forest so that it didn't spread as far. Um, but then the government said you can't do that anymore, and so it kind of went by the wayside. But so now we're going back and we're having these conversations with those experts, and saying, okay, how do we fight climate change with firefighters or with rivers or whatever the case may be, right? Just even knowing how the caribou have moved this winter is telling Indigenous elders what the summer will be like. But that's certainly not something that like I would know from or you would know from having a science background. It's definitely there's an opportunity there to get a lot of knowledge, and there's a couple great courses actually you can take as well. I have heard from other people say they're really good, like pulling the two together.
I do follow you on Goodreads as well.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, so I see a lot of the books that you read, and I really admire that. The fact that you're an avid reader. Do you have some top recommendations for the audience? Like if folks in the audience and myself as well are interested in learning more about Indigenous culture, what are the top like 3 or 4 books that you recommend?
So in the nonfiction side, 21 Things You Didn't Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph is fantastic. It's nice and simple, and it's an easy read. You can also listen to it on Audible. I Sometimes people don't like to read, and I'm like, you can listen to it on Audible. In the I would say also in the nonfiction, Seven Fallen Feathers by Tanya Tulaga. Great book about kids being going to Thunder Bay to go to high school because they had to leave their communities, and sort of the tragedy that came from that, and also the racism and discrimination that took place in the city of Thunder Bay. She has a follow up book called All My Relations. I think she's a great writer. She was a journalist, now writer. Michelle Good's book Five Little Indians, which is fictional, is one of the best books I've ever read about the impact of residential school. So, it's not one person's story, which there's lots of books out there about that, and I'm happy to recommend a couple of them. But it's like 5 different stories. It's like it's not it's people who how they survived in community after residential school, like how they recovered, how their families were impacted, how they went home and couldn't speak the language anymore, or their parents had, gone down like a well of depression because their kids were missing. It's so well done. She's a great writer, and she also has another book called Truth Telling, and it's nonfiction, but it's got sort of that like that really the meat of the story. Like when people ask me to tell my story, I I kind of go all over the place, and these writers are able to just put it down so nicely, really nicely. I also think for young kids, the Orange Shirt story is nicely written, not too difficult to read, and it's a great picture book, and I think we should be definitely reading that to our kids at 5 or 6, which is the age that they would have been taken. There's also some great podcasts and you know I would say mini series like that you can watch. But those books are I recommend them to everybody. There's another one called by Thomas King. It's called um, the history of being Indian in Canada and the US. It's very good. He's very funny. So you get a little humor in that. It's called An Inconvenient in Indian, and then it's the history. So yeah, there's depending on what you want, you can go different ways. There's so many good books out there right now. Canada Reads is happening next week. I don't know if you follow Canada Reads, but so on CBC radio they pick 5 books and then they have a debate about which book every Canadian should read.
Mhm.
And for the last 5 years, there has been an Indigenous author every year, and more than often than not, they've won. Yeah. So it's obviously something that people are interested in learning about. This year's is a fictional story called Bad Creek. A bit of a horror, but it's very good. And I wouldn't be surprised if it wins. I've read them all, of course. You follow me on Goodreads, you know that.
I
But
know.
I wouldn't be surprised if it takes the.
I'll include a link to all of these books in the description. I think it's great to have this list, right, as a kind of like a beginner's guide to entering this domain. Like personally for me, I have a very strong interest because I'm also an immigrant to this land, right, and first generation immigrant, and someone who comes from a background where colonization was the default,
Yeah.
right, and so when I hear these Indigenous stories and I hear a lot of the history, it really I reflect back at my family's history.
A lot from immigrants, actually.
Yeah.
I do. Yeah.
So I think it's great. Like I love all folks in the nuclear industry should make an effort, right, to check out some of these books and in the free time.
Yeah.
And yeah, like it was a pleasure having you on the podcast, Tracy.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure hearing from you and inspired by your leadership in the industry. Is there any last message that you'd like to share with the audience?
I guess I would just say that I know that I know that your audience is a lot of young people, and so I'm going to say the nuclear industry is the place to be right now. There's just so much going on, and you don't have to be an engineer or an operator. You can work in any area of expertise and still be part of this industry. Whether it's communications or at the Bruce site, for example, we have like doctors and nurses and physiotherapists and firefighters and there's all kinds of things you can do in our industry, and we're just growing and growing. The opportunity is endless, and so I encourage people to, look if they're not already looking, to look, and if they are looking, to keep looking for other opportunities. And then finally, I would say from the Indigenous side, just start having conversations. Maybe it's just at your dinner table, where you're talking about, that maybe the 92 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's like a 6-page document. You can talk about them a little bit. Whatever the case is, just start having those conversations.
Absolutely. Well, Tracy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate this chat.
Miigwech.
Miigwech.